Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of In a Heartbeat. I'm your host, John Clor. If you've been a regular watcher of In a Heartbeat, then you know that it's always been about your health and well-being and the information we can give you to make that life of yours a little bit better. And if you see me on the show, you know somehow I always bring the talk around to cars. Well, you know, it wasn't such a stretch a little while back when we talked about the health and the well-being of the city of Detroit and how cars had made a very serious impact on not only our health as a city and our economic health as a state, but really across the entire country. And we did a great little story back then about the old plant down on the east side, about the Packard plant. And we brought in a good friend to come and talk to us about that facility and about what it meant to the city and our health as a giant among the industrial nations. And I'll tell you what, we've had a lot of great feedback from that show. So to come back and give us another fun trip through Detroit's heritage, go ahead and let the dog out and bring the kids around the TV. You're going to want to sit down on this one and find out a little bit more about this great motor city with our visit with Joe Babiasz. Joe, welcome back to In a Heartbeat.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
I'm telling you, Joe, we had such a really great response to our little insight on the Packard plant that I really think that if you're a school teacher or folks, if you're just an auto buff, it's time to call the War Memorial and get a copy made and have that in your personal collection, because, Joe, there was a lot of history there, and I think a lot of people would be amazed to know how that Packard plant had really affected the city over many, many years.
It certainly did, and that wasn't the only plant. I mean, Detroit had an abundant number of automobile plants, the Packard, certainly Hudson,
Yeah.
The Ford Motor Company, and several factories and so on. So Detroit has a very rich history in the auto business.
Well, being an auto buff and a journalist and now a historian, you know as well as I do that I'm afraid a lot of our heritage is lost on many people, and they don't really understand why we call ourselves the Motor City. They see the auto industry spreading out, especially down south with the import makes. And they don't understand how the health of this state and really the health of our economy. There was one of the presidents who said that how GM goes, so goes the nation. I believe it was it Woodrow Wilson?
Boy,
I mean, one of those old sayings that people said he never really said that, the president, but really when you talk to
Well, I think it was one of the presidents of General Motors made that comment.
Okay, yeah, you're right. And I think what happened is that the government of the United States soon realized that after we became the arsenal of democracy and really won World War II because of our manufacturing might. So I really wanted to talk to you today about another fantastic historical factory located very close in the city. You say it's a little bit in the city. Let's go back and kind of explore another great institution, if you will, that really had an impact on the health of the city of Detroit and the entire region. And that's the factory that kind of built the car that changed the world, which people know as the Model T. Now, what's the actual name of the plant? A lot of people have different names for it. Is it the Highland Park Assembly Plant?
It is the Highland Park Assembly Plant. It was also known as the Crystal Palace,
Okay.
And it was known as the Crystal Palace because Ford put about 50,000 square feet of glass in the ceiling to get natural light, and it did several things. It provided really good lighting, at least for the daytime employees.
Sure.
But it was also free, you know? And that's a good thing. So it was also known as the Crystal Palace.
Folks, in case you're not really going back far enough with us, we're going all the way back to the Model T, which was really, yes, Daimler-Benz created the automobile, but those cars that were built early in the turn of the century were for rich people. And really, mobility wasn't for the everyman. And it wasn't until Henry Ford kind of adapted some of these assembly line techniques to give us a car that we could sell to every guy, every woman, every man that had a job and could save up his money could drive a car. And this Model T was quite the thing. It was almost an SUV. It could get through rotten roads that we didn't have really roads back then. The car really preceded our road system, and yet it was affordable, and it was really dependable, and it was all built here in the Detroit area.
It was first designed and built actually at Ford's Piquette Street factory.
Okay, now that's the one that people talk about is that off of Woodward?
Right off of Woodward, Piquette Street, and the plant is now a wonderful automobile museum. I welcome anybody to go there. It's really a good place to go. So Ford designed in his secret room at Piquette Street the Model T, he and a few employees. They started producing it at Piquette in 1908. And during its build in Piquette, built about 12,000 Model Ts there. Henry quickly realized he needed a bigger facility, went and purchased a little over 100 acres in Highland Park, contacted Albert Kahn, who had just completed building the wonderful Packard plant.
Yeah, we just talked about
to
that.
To design the Highland Park assembly plant. And in 1910, they opened up and started transfer the production of the Model T to Highland Park. Although not immediately, it wasn't immediately mass assembled. It was still a station-built car at that time.
So, but why did they call this the car that changed the world? A lot of people don't really realize, I mean, yeah, the Model T was accessible, which really made it the big difference was that you could buy one. But what was about the Model T that really caused those sales to skyrocket that first year? What was it? I mean, what was the big button that
Well, a lot of it was price. At this point, the early part of the turn of the century, most cars were for the wealthy people. They were $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 at that time. When the Model T came out in 1908, it was about $950. Still a little expensive, but more affordable than most cars at the time.
Right.
Also, it was really, while a basic car, it was very reliable and dependable, had a real high center of gravity and a very high, a lot of room between the ground and the car itself, so it could get through the rutted roads of the early 20th century. And it was, again, reasonable for the average person.
You know, when we talk about the T, a lot of people don't really realize that, you know, it's that car more than anything else, not just changed the way we got around, really kind of changed our employment. Now, you said he started at Piquette. Was Piquette just too small, or was it just a matter of it was too close to Woodward? Did he not have rail service? Because I know once you start getting a big assembly plant, like we saw at the Packard plant, rail was important, transportation, you know, having the room to spread out and make your facility all in one was really important to Henry Ford.
Yeah, well, Piquette was about 68,000 square feet, very small when you consider an assembly plant, as compared to the Model T Highland Park plant that grew to about 3 million square feet. So the Piquette plant was dedicated to station build. It could not get any bigger. There was a competitor car company right next door. There was no place to expand.
Right.
So Henry expanded into Highland Park. Later, though, he would find that what he did at Highland Park, he didn't purchase enough property, which forced him then to go to the Rouge, where he bought 1,200 acres to make sure that he never had a problem with
this is more, I mean, this factory is huge. I mean, it's a huge place, and I know you have some pictures, and we can look at what's the...
Yeah, this is a photo of the plant. I believe this is maybe in the 30s, and you can see how large the factory was, and the Ford's smokestacks from the powerhouse. Much of the plant today still stands, although few of those buildings that front Woodward Avenue are now gone. But it gives you an idea of Highland Park at that time, and it was a really, really big
Well,
place.
the city of Highland Park was like a tiny little suburb. I mean, this must have completely transformed the city to all of a sudden have this giant factory not only stuck right in the middle of the city, but now all these people come streaming in. It's kind of changed the whole dynamic of what Highland Park was all about.
That's true. Before Ford went to Highland Park, the city had about 500 citizens.
Wow.
5 years later, as in 1909, by 1914, when Ford ramped up for mass production of the Model T, the city grew to 27,000 people. The problem was they didn't have enough housings. It grew so quickly that the workers had to sleep in shifts in the same bed. Day shift worker would rent a room, sleep in the evening, and the night shift worker would sleep in the same bed in the same room during the day.
Wow.
And so it really became a mess. At its peak, Ford had 50,000 employees at that factory.
Now,
50,000.
What we need to figure out, folks, is imagine, if you will, a factory coming into a city, and all of a sudden there's not enough housing. And when we look at Detroit today and we see the stock of housing that is just gone abandoned, we can see why it was such a drastic need for companies to have the ability for transportation and to get those workers to and from the plant. I know when you showed us earlier, also some of the construction techniques really lended itself well to making a strong spread out factory where you didn't have to go through so many floors. When Highland Park was first built, did they still use that construction technique that Albert Kahn used at the Packard plant of reinforced steel concrete?
Yes.
They put steel beams and they reinforced them with concrete. That was the same system used at Ford?
Right. That allowed them to initially build 4-story buildings in front, and then later on, when they went to the mass production of the entire car, they went to a 6-story facility, or 6-story buildings.
So the weight of that
it allowed Ford to go up and to build the cars as they went down.
Well, let's talk about a little bit, folks. When you think about being called the Crystal Palace or the Glass Palace, as some workers call it, think about when we were just at the turn of the century, and here is an architect, Albert Kahn, who did the Fisher Building, a lot of the GM buildings downtown. He's done his footprint is all over the city of Detroit. But think about how green it is to think about, well, how are we going to light this plant, and how will we be able to get the workers so they can see what they're doing, and to build these walls and ceilings of light to come streaming in on a sunny day, even on a cloudy day, to flood the entire assembly area. It was pure genius, Joe, back then.
Yeah, well, you'll see in the photo on the screen now all of the windows on the side, plus the 50,000 square feet of lighting in the roof. And there was a lot of natural lighting. Certainly in his night shift, he had to power it up, but he had his own powerhouse. He produced his own power. He didn't rely on anyone else. So Ford was ready for that.
Now, the rumor that we talked about a little bit earlier was about why did he go to Highland Park? You know, he had this Detroit plant, and a lot of people thought it was, well, he needed a bigger plant. But you say that something that affects where businesses locate in certain places nowadays was at play then, and it had something to do with the taxes?
Yeah, Ford did what General Motors did later on at Poletown. Ford moved out of the city of Detroit because the tax base was so high. Highland Park was just a sleepy community, had a very low tax base, had a lot of room, and land was cheap. So it was better, it behooved him to move out of the city into Highland Park. Then many years later, again, General Motors did that with their current Poletown plant. Most of it resides in Hamtramck, only a small portion of it's in Detroit.
And if you folks think out there that this is only something that the domestic automakers do, you need to do a little bit of homework on all of the import plants that came to the United States. Were all given huge incentives. Some highways were moved where there wasn't the infrastructure like there is here in Michigan and Detroit. This stuff all had to be put into place, but it was well worth the investment that the states and some of the communities would make, because, Joe, the bottom line was it created tons of income and generated an entire source of wealth for Highland Park. It kind of grew in leaps and bounds after that. I mean, so let's talk about, so he brings in the T. The T is being built there, but that really wasn't the start of what we know as the moving assembly line. It started in small little pieces. What was the first mass production piece in Highland Park?
It was the magneto build. Originally,
now, some people may not know what a magneto is.
It is, yeah. It provides the power to the motor, and one person would produce about 35 magnetos per day. They would assemble the entire magneto. Henry broke that magneto build into many substations with 14 employees assembling the magneto, and they went from 35 magnetos per person day to about 95 magnetos per person day. So that was the first tryout for mass production.
So it's just one part here, the ignition system of this car. It took these people so long to build one. He said, you know, like, if we could mass produce these faster, we wouldn't have to wait on the magnetos coming down to the line. That's a piece of brilliance.
Exactly, and then he went from the magneto to other sub-assemblies, and eventually in 1914 made the entire car, put the assembly lines in and made the entire car mass produced. And at that point, he started producing cars for the masses.
Yeah.
And what it did was, initially in 1908, Model T cost $950. By 1925, it was down to $260.
That reminds me of my VCR. Who has a VCR anymore anyway? But remember when those came out? I mean, the price was so high. Maybe the same will happen with iPhones and some of the technologies. The weird thing that people think that Ford just one day went to bed and got up the next day and dreamed up the assembly line. But as you're saying, that's not what happened at all. It was one piece. Well, then I can apply that to this next piece and to the next piece, and then eventually grew that whole assembly thing to the Model T. Now, that when it started bringing in people, that had to mean, man, people from all over were employed. So we had to get workers from outside of Detroit. We had immigrant workers. I mean, that must have been, were there language barriers?
There were. There weren't enough local folks to work at Ford's factories, or in all the factories. About three-quarters of Ford's employees were foreigners, were from foreign lands. Most of them did not speak English because it created a problem, a language barrier in terms of explaining to them how to assemble a part, or if there's a problem, you know, how do we explain it to them? Ford mandated that they go to an English class, or they were fired. In addition, he sent everyone to an etiquette class to teach them how to live properly.
Yeah, the manners.
Yeah, so all the employees had to go do that, and but ultimately it was a better thing for everyone.
Yeah, can you imagine, folks? There was no press 2 for English. You had to learn the language, understand the culture, and be assimilated into the workforce, or you couldn't hold your job down. I mean,
Exactly.
it was told. I mean, it may be considered politically incorrect today, but it certainly was the basis to incorporate the immigrant society into what really is now the heart of America, which is our blending of all the melting pot, if you will, of all these people coming for work. Now, that brings us to the biggest subject that, for me, one of my favorite things to talk about isn't so much the fact that they built the T. It was they built the middle class.
They did.
And the creation of Highland Park, the creation of the Model T and the assembly line, and all these people now streaming into this area created another idea with Mr. Ford. And it wasn't just, okay, now I have all these people working, I want to sell more cars. How do you sell more cars, Joe?
Well, you sell it by making your workers a buyer. And Henry did that by more than doubling the average worker's pay to $5 a day. At that time, factory workers earned a little bit more than $2 a day. Henry upped it to $5, at the same time reducing the hours from 9 hours to 8 hours per day.
That's unheard of. I mean, so you're going to double some guy's salary, cut his hours, and all of a sudden you're creating all this wealth that for the average worker, just you wouldn't believe why we have unions. People didn't understand. That was a tough job. That was not exactly the safest, easiest job in the world to do, and those people were rewarded by getting this great pay. And now, Joe, everybody could really afford this car because we're all making good money, we're all working hard, and we got this salary that overnight doubled.
That's true.
So
but keep in mind, it wasn't automatic. He didn't walk in one day and tell his payroll office, double everyone's pay.
Yeah.
People had to meet criteria. Ford had a sociology department,
right,
and he would send employees to the workers' homes to inspect their homes. He was a teetotaler. He didn't want them smoking. He didn't want them drinking. He wanted their houses to be clean. He wanted them to be upstanding citizens.
Amazing.
And if after the inspection they did not meet Ford's criteria, they did not get the $5 a day. It was pretty tough.
Unbelievable.
Pretty
Can
tough.
you imagine today, folks, we have a big issue now with employers wanting to know about your Facebook page passwords. But to let your boss come into your house and see if you were following the corporate rules or you'd lose your job, talk about politically difficult in today's world.
Today.
Well, so we have this great success story. We built the middle class. We built a car that everybody did buy. By the way, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Model Ts were everywhere. So what you build? How many millions of these things did we wind up building?
15 million. 15 million between 1908 and 1927. Ford produced 15 million cars. Incredible amount. And at its peak, Ford produced 9,000 cars a day. And as you know, John, most factories today, on a good day, will do 1,000 to 1,200. He did 9,000 cars a day.
Back then, with the tools.
Exactly.
And the technology.
Now, granted, it was a very simple car.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we did not have a lot of the tools that we have today. Certainly, ergonomics wasn't even in their, they had no idea what ergonomics was. It was very difficult work. But again, the workers were paid well. They became buyers. And ultimately, Ford sold 15 million.
And the raw materials, that was things like wood, wooden spoke, the dashboards. Why would they call it a firewall? Well, in that vehicle, the gas tank was right in front of the driver, between the engine. And why was it there? Because it was gravity feed. The gas tank had to be above the engine, so the gravity. And people didn't realize that when they started using these cars, if you were driving uphill, and the gas would wash back when you had low on fuel. A lot of people were driving up hills backwards, and they didn't realize why are you driving up the hill backwards in your Model T? Well, if you turned it around, gravity fed would put that tank, the gas would slosh right over the opening and get down into the engine, gravity fed, and it worked better backwards. These are the kinds of things we learned by using our automobiles. And Joe, it spawned an entire cottage industry. There were the power outputs from your Model T could drive wash machines on the farm.
That's true.
These cars were not just cars getting you to market. We made trucks from them, the pickup truck.
TT trucks.
The TT trucks. So all of our stuff got to market. And then we were putting PTOs off these cars and driving farm implements, hay balers. The Model T could do just about anything, either home or farm. So we kind of putting the horse guys out of business.
Henry certainly did.
All right, so what happened? So we're going great guns, we're building all these cars, and all of a sudden the world's kind of changing. What was the downfall of the Model T? Was it just something this product that run its course?
The downfall was Henry. Henry was a genius, but he was very stubborn, and he resisted change at every turn. His son Edsel had been asking for years to come up with he wanted to come up with a new car.
A new design.
And Henry kept thinking that this Model T, I can just keep building it and building it and building it. Well, by the early 20s, GM was getting real strong. Chevrolet was starting to have more sales than Ford. And when you looked at a Model T, by the early mid-20s, it was nothing compared to a Chevrolet. Yeah. But yet Henry wanted to keep on going. And so eventually sales he kept lowering the price to keep sales up, and even by lowering the price down to the $260 or $290 or so.
Can you imagine a car for $290?
No, I can't. But even with that, sales continued to drop.
Yeah,
so in the meantime, Edsel was able to convince Dad, look, we need to come up with something new. They came up with the Model A. But at the same time, Henry had purchased property in Dearborn for the River Rouge plant. Yeah. In 1970, actually started building boats for World War I efforts. But eventually, that became the plant that replaced the Model T with the Model A in 1928.
So there are two dynamics going on here. First, Mr. Ford had an interest in creating a complex that and if you people have done your homework on the Rouge, and I hope you all go to the Rouge tour if you haven't done it recently, the new tour out there watching the F-150s build is awesome. But when you see the Rouge, he wanted rubber to come in and make his own tires. He wanted the wood for the woodies and the wagons and the wood pieces made right there. Coal, steel was made right there. Glass was made right there. I mean, essentially, all the raw materials from all over the world wound up coming down the Rouge River and going to the Rouge facility, and then he would make all of his pieces of these cars at one place, so he didn't have what we call suppliers today.
Well, what happened was Henry realized when things started going real well for him, with the Model T, he still didn't make everything. He didn't manufacture everything. He had suppliers making some body parts and other Dodge Brothers early on, built engines and so on. So what was happening is he now had this landlocked factory, almost 120 acres, and the only thoroughfare was Woodward.
Woodward Avenue, yeah.
And so you can picture, let's say somebody else is producing fenders and doors. 9,000 of these had to come up Woodward Avenue somehow. They're most likely locally built. They weren't going on a train. They might have.
Sure.
And some parts did come in by train. So Henry realized two things. Number one, he couldn't keep up with this. He had gotten himself in a spot. He wound up buying the 1,200 acres to eliminate it. But he also realized that with his suppliers, they were always kind of like cost plus.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, why should I give them the money?
Yeah.
I'll just make it myself. So he not only built the Rouge to do this, but he bought massive amounts of lumber, forest up north. He built everything, and he actually wound up building or manufacturing almost everything for the Model A.
It was truly amazing. Folks, when you think about what the Rouge complex did, the steel taconite that we got out of the Upper Peninsula, the entire shipping industry that we know on the Great Lakes was really kind of fed by this need to make steel down in Detroit. And there were freighters made just to haul the steel. I mean, just for the fact that this manufacturing facility happened here gave us the infrastructure to do all kinds of other things. It created all kinds of other industries, which is really important for us to know. Also, by the time we got to the Rouge plant and the Model B and then A came out, Ford had the opportunity to go from that little 4-cylinder engine to a 6, like Chevrolet was building.
V8.
No, they had the opportunity to go to the 6.
Oh, okay.
But the planning was they wanted to build this V8, and Henry thought that was crazy. And I didn't. First of all, there was no casting for it. People, when they first thought of the idea, thought because it's on a V, it would wear out the sides of the pistons. But because the decision was made to give us that V8 engine in 1932, America then fell in love with their automobile. It wasn't just this little putt-putt thing. We fell in love with horsepower and the idea of freedom and styling. Is when the competition between General Motors and Chrysler and Ford all came out. The V8 engine, and there's still papers in the Henry Ford Museum after bank robbers would thank Mr. Ford for outrunning the competition.
That's true.
With that
the
first. But what happened to Highland Park then? I mean, what really happened to the plant after it moved to Rouge?
After the Model T stopped, they built their last Model T on May 26, 1927. And after that, they continued building tractors and trucks through 1973.
Wow.
So it did have a long life as a Ford facility. In 1981, a developer purchased the building. They knocked down some of the older buildings that were the oldest buildings that fronted on Woodward.
Right.
And the southern end along the corner of Manchester and Woodward is now Model T Plaza, as you see on the screen.
Oh, that's cool.
And so it's a shopping plaza. The administration, or one of the two administration buildings, is still along the Woodward corridor. And the back part, the part that that built the Model T with the assembly lines, is still there and being
Wow.
used for storage.
I think it's, Joe, you always like to show us the before and after, then and now. Do you have a couple of those? Do you have?
Yeah, I have two shots of, I have one shot of before and after. Now that there's a shot of the bodies being dropped.
Oh, yeah.
In
little
the
slide,
side, down
yeah.
the slide.
Okay. And what they did, they actually took the chassis, rolled them under, and slid these bodies right down on top of them.
Right down, and that building, that part of the building is still there. The hole is now closed up, but I do have a shot of that where the same spot where the bodies would come out and Ford would drop the bodies on the chassis. This is a shot of the Manchester Street side. You can see how long this building
Wow.
is. These are the 6 stories that we're looking at. That's where the assembly line was really invented. And it's still there for storage.
Now, is anyone going to worry about preserving this historic place for us?
Yeah, it's so important to work on preservation of these old factories. And the Woodward Avenue Action Association just received a grant to purchase the administration building and the executive garage, along with about 3 acres of property. Now, the grant covers part of the cost. They still have to come up with another 20% to purchase it. And their goal is, within 5 years, to make it an auto heritage center.
Sure, we need it.
And it would be a wonderful thing to do. And so if anyone would like to contribute or help out, contact the Woodward Avenue Action Association. They'll be happy to work with you in any fashion. It'll be great. It would be wonderful to see this thing as a heritage center. It's a perfect spot for it.
We need it, and when people come to Detroit, they really have to understand our heritage as the Motor City. Joe, the information was great. If they want to call the Woodward Avenue Action Association, 248-288-2004. Again, I want to thank you for coming in.
Thanks, John. My pleasure.
The time flew by way too fast, and again, just having us being enriched on our wonderful automotive heritage that really did, folks, have a huge impact on the health and well-being of all of us in Detroit and in the state of Michigan, and really the health of our economy. If only our domestic industry can get that strong again, then the health of our economy will come back, and we won't be talking about recessions and things like that.
Let's hope so.
Okay, Joe Babiasz, again, we'll catch you on automotivetraveler.com. I know some of your work is now appearing on fordracing.com. It's a pleasure to have you. We'll have him back soon. Folks, again, thanks for joining us here on In a Heartbeat. Remember, the bottom line is knowledge is power. I'll see you again next time. I'm John Clor.